The rancher hired her to bake bread, but her kindness to his child made him buy her a ring instead. Colorado Territory, May 1869. The wind rolled off the high plains like the breath of an ancient god, dry, relentless, and without sympathy. It clawed at the freight wagon, a mournful sound as it creaked over the rutted earth. Dust, the color of old bone, billowed around the wheels, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. This was a land that didn't forgive, and the road that stretched toward a cattle ranch was a testament to that, worn by weather and the silent passage of years. Grace Evans stepped down from the wagon, a solitary figure against the vast, empty canvas of the sky. She carried a single, faded canvas satchel, and nothing else to her name. The sun beat down on her, a fierce, unapologetic heat, but she did not flinch. Her boots were cracked, the leather scuffed and weary from travel, and her hands were rough, the skin calloused from holding on to something, anything, for too long. Yet her back was ramrod straight, a defiance against the wind and the world. She had come a long way from the green fields of Kansas, and even further from the girl she used to be. Born the daughter of a preacher, she once knew scripture better than songs, the rhythms of faith more familiar than her own heartbeat. But faith, like a dry riverbed, had cracked and fractured after one long winter, leaving only a hollow space behind. Whatever secret sorrow she carried behind her calm, gray eyes had driven her west, toward a place no one would know her name, and a job that promised blessed anonymity. The ranch sat quiet in the afternoon heat, a collection of weathered wood and sun-bleached fences. A few horses shifted in the corral, their ears flicking at the flies that buzzed in the heavy air. In the distance, she could see men working the fields, their sleeves rolled, their heads bowed against the sun. They moved with the same slow, patient rhythm as the land itself. And then he appeared. He came from the main house, walking with a measured, deliberate pace. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked more worn than old. He was a shadow of a man, a study in brown and gray-brown hat, brown clothes, a gray stubble on his jaw. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't ask what brought her here. He simply stopped a few feet away and looked her over, a long, assessing gaze that went from the top of her worn straw hat to the soles of her boots. It was a look that bypassed the person and went straight to the question of utility. "You're Grace Evans," he said, his voice a low rumble, worn smooth like river rock. "I am. They call me Hayes." He nodded toward the main house. "I need someone to bake bread. I do not need someone telling stories or asking questions." Grace's resolve hardened. She met his gaze directly. "I'm here for the work," she said, her voice calm and clear, betraying none of her exhaustion. "Not to get in the way of anyone's life." He gave a single curt nod. "The job's for 2 months. You bake every morning, enough for the hands, and extra for the Saturday market." He turned and pointed with a long finger. "You will stay there." He was indicating a small, weathered shed, nestled beside the cattle barn. It was a humble, silent structure, leaning slightly as if tired from a long life. "You will stay there. Keep to yourself. And do not go near my daughter." Grace's eyebrow lifted just a fraction. The words were a warning, a perimeter drawn in the dust. "I don't plan on braiding anyone's hair." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "She does not talk. Has not since her mother passed. That is not your concern. Do the job. Stay out of the rest." The finality in his tone was absolute. Grace understood. It wasn't just a warning. It was a rule born of deep, unhealed grief. She felt a flicker of something, a sad recognition, but she pushed it down. She hadn't come here to offer sympathy. She had come here to hide. "I remember," she said, her own voice flat and steady. "When do I start?" Calder looked toward the falling sun, its light turning the dust to gold. "Now." The shed was a hollow space of bare earth and rough-hewn wood, but it was cleaner than Grace expected. There was a single cot with a thin, folded blanket, a small wood-burning stove, and a tiny window facing east. The evening light filtered through the pane, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Grace lit a lantern, the soft glow chasing the shadows into the corners. She unlatched her satchel and pulled out what she had. A small packet of flour wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of salt, and at the very bottom, her most treasured possession. Her mother's rolling pin, worn smooth and shiny from years of use. It smelled of flour and old memories, a silent relic of a life she no longer knew. A life where her mother hummed hymns while her hands moved with a quiet, prayerful grace over dough. Grace ran her thumb over the polished wood. A flash of pain in her heart. Then she set to work. She rose before dawn, the world outside a deep, velvety black. The ranch was still sleeping, save for the proud crow of a rooster and the rustle of horses in the corral. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth. Grace's fingers were numb as she split kindling, the axe blade biting into the dry wood with a satisfying crack. She fed the fire, a small, licking flame that grew into a roaring warmth. Then she began to work the dough, her movements quiet and precise. There was no sugar, no butter, no richness in the ingredients, but the bread would hold. It would be simple and solid, just like the life she was trying to build. By sunrise, the sweet, yeasty smell of baking bread drifted from the shed. It crept past the barn, a fragrant promise, and into the open air. Her arms were dusted in flour, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm. Fold, press, roll, score. That was when she saw the child. A little girl, no more than 4, stood at the edge of the barn. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was tangled by the persistent wind. In her hand, she held a doll that was little more than a scrap of rags tied with twine. She did not speak. She did not move. She just stood there, a silent watcher, a ghost against the barn's dark wood. Grace said nothing. Her heart gave a small, unbidden tug. She took one of the smaller loaves, still steaming, wrapped it in a square of worn cloth, and placed it gently on the railing of the shed's porch. When she looked back, the girl was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. That evening, Calder returned from the fields, the day's work still etched on his face. He came to the shed, his boots dusty. He took a roll from the basket Grace had left on the table. He didn't say a word, just bit into it, chewing slowly, thoughtfully. Grace watched him. His face was unreadable. After a long moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Not bad," he said. "I was baking before I ever believed in anything," Grace replied, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. The words slipped out, a moment of unguarded truth. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and turned back to her. His eyes, dark as the deepest well, were on hers. "Do not forget what I said," he stated, his voice a low warning. "I remember." He left, and the silence rushed back in. Grace returned to the stove, her hands busy, her mind reeling. She knew what she was doing was dangerous. She was breaking his first and most important rule. Later, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. The cloth she had wrapped the bread in was gone from the railing. In its place was a single, tiny white flower, a little star against the rough wood. A whisper of an answer. Sometimes the prairie does not shout. It whispers. And if you listen close enough, you can hear the start of something worth staying for. If you feel it, if some part of this quiet beginning speaks to you, tap the like button. Because out here, where hearts are guarded and grief runs deep, even a simple loaf of bread can change everything. The days that followed were dry, the wind unforgiving, but every morning was a rhythm. Before the first crow of the rooster, and long before the ranch hands stirred in their bunks, Grace was already at work. She had rebuilt the shed's small oven by hand, stacking river rocks into a dome shape, patching it with clay from the creek bed and ash from last week's burns. It stood now behind the main house, just beyond the reach of the cattle fence, warm and breathing like a living thing. Her hands, though blistered, moved with a purpose. Measure, mix, knead. Dust from the flour clouded the morning light as it poured into her shed window, a small, quiet storm. The dough took shape like old memories, quiet and resilient. Each morning she baked 8 loaves for the men, 2 for the market, and 1 small, round loaf that she did not mention to anyone. That one she wrapped in a faded square of floral cloth. No name, no note, just bread still warm from the oven. And every morning, she left it at the base of the old wooden swing that hung from the cottonwood tree behind the barn. That was where the child sat. Annie Hayes, for years old, white blonde hair always tangled, eyes always cautious. She never spoke, never reached out, just sat there. A doll limp in her lap, her feet bare against the swing's wooden plank. She would watch Grace from a distance, her gaze as silent and steady as the landscape itself. Grace never tried to approach her. She never waved, never said her name. She simply set the bread down and walked away. And every evening, when she returned to gather the cloth, the bread was gone. She knew Calder saw it. Once or twice, she caught him leaning against the fence post, arms crossed, jaw tight. But he never said a word. He did not stop her. He did not thank her. He just watched. And in a place where watching was more honest than speaking, that was enough. One afternoon, the wind changed. It came in fast from the east, sweeping through the yard in dry, powerful bursts. The oven was already hot, the flames licking the edges of the river stones, and Grace had just turned to fetch water from the well when a gust hit. A cluster of dry straw, stacked beside the shed, caught a live coal that had popped from the oven and burst into flame. Grace's eyes went wide. "Damn it! No! No!" she gasped, grabbing the pail beside the door. But the wind was too quick. The flames spread into the dry grass, dancing toward the edge of the woodpile. Her skirts brushed against the fire's heat as she tried to smother it with a wet burlap sack. Her right hand slapped down on a smoldering patch, and a bolt of pain shot up her arm. Then, boots thundered across the ground. Calder appeared through the smoke, his shirt pulled over his mouth. He was already in motion, grabbing another pail, then stomping through the fire without a moment's hesitation. Water hit the flames with a hiss. His coat dropped over a burning patch. Together, they battled the blaze, coughing, slapping, stomping until the last curl of smoke vanished into the blue sky. Grace fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Her right hand was red, the skin stretched and raw from the heat. Calder dropped beside her, his movement quick and precise. He reached for her wrist. "Let me see," he said, his voice low. "It's fine." She winced, trying to pull away. "Let me see." She surrendered her hand. He opened a tin from his coat pocket, a salve he had carried since the winter, and began to gently smear it over her palm and up to her wrist. Her breath caught, not from the pain, but from the tenderness of his touch. It was a gesture so unexpected, so deeply human, that it shattered her composure. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice rough. "I didn't need someone to save my oven either," he replied, his voice low and raspy from the smoke. "But you did." Their eyes met, not as employer and hired help, not yet as anything else. Just two people in a field of smoke, bound for a moment by something neither could name. He finished with the salve, his touch lingering for a second too long. Then he stood first, brushing ash from his sleeves. He didn't say anything more. She watched him walk back toward the barn, a dark figure against the orange twilight, and in the quiet of the coming night, the silence between them no longer felt empty, felt like peace. The wind had quieted, a softer presence now, a gentle murmur rather than a roar. Outside, the fire-stained earth was a dark scar on the prairie, but the oven still stood, a testament to their quiet victory. The next morning, the swing swayed gently in the breeze. The bread was gone again, the cloth folded neatly at the base of the cottonwood. The next morning after that, however, the swing was empty. Grace did not look for the child. She simply worked as she always did, her hands moving with the quiet care of someone shaping more than just bread. Her fingers kneaded the dough, turning it over and over like folded cloth. It was a familiar ritual, a balm for her bruised soul. But this time, when she looked up from the mixing bowl, Annie was standing closer. Not at the porch, not at the barn, but right there at the corner of the oven. Her doll was tucked beneath one arm, its yarn hair tangled. She was a silent observer, her eyes fixed on Grace's hands. Grace kept her movements slow and steady, her heart beating a little faster. "You want to help?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur, not expecting an answer. The child stepped forward, her small, bare feet silent on the dusty earth. She didn't speak, but she reached up, her tiny fingers dipping into the flour-dusted bowl, pressing into the dough as if it were something alive. Grace smiled gently. She tore off a small lump, set it on the wooden board, and picked up a dull carving knife. With quick, precise flicks of her wrist, she shaped a sun with wide, radiating rays, then handed the knife to Annie. "Your turn." Annie hesitated for a moment, then took the knife. Her tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth as she worked, completely focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She carved something uneven. For legs, a tail, a long neck, a lopsided, endearing creature. "A horse?" Grace guessed, her voice filled with gentle warmth. Annie nodded once, a small, proud motion. For the next hour, they sat together on the ground, creating a menagerie out of dough. Cats with crooked smiles, birds with button eyes, stars and hearts. When they finally placed the figures in the oven, Grace leaned in close. "Now comes the magic," she whispered. Annie sat cross-legged beside her, watching through the open mouth of the firestone. As the heat rose, the little shapes puffed up, softened, and browned. Then it happened. The dough horse, the first thing Annie had ever made, puffed so wide it tipped over, landing with its belly up and its legs askew. Annie blinked, a slow, bewildered movement. Then she laughed. Not loud, not long, but real. It was a high-pitched, airy sound, like a breath-catching sunlight, a sound Grace had never heard before. It froze her in place. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with shock and wonder. Annie's hands flew to her mouth, startled by the sound of her own joy, but it was too late. Grace did not scold her. She only smiled, a wide, breathtaking smile, and reached for the misshapen horse. "It's the first one I ever saw lie down after a long ride," she said softly. From the window of the main house, Calder watched. He did not move. He only stood there, arms folded across his chest, eyes fixed on the two figures crouched by the fire. His face was a mask, giving nothing away, but his hand tightened once on the rough windowsill before he turned away. That night, Grace returned to her shed to find a surprise. Neatly stacked beside her door was a bundle of dry wood, tied with a length of twine. It was enough for 3 days. No note, no word, just a quiet act of kindness. A smile spread across her face, and she carried it inside. Later, under the quiet flicker of her oil lamp, she heard footsteps approach, slow and steady. There was a single, soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Calder was standing there, his hat in hand, his face half-shaded by shadow and firelight. "Do you need more flour?" he asked, his voice low. "I have enough for tomorrow," she replied. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched, brimming with unspoken questions. "She laughed," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Grace nodded, a simple confirmation. "She did." Another long silence. Calder looked down at the ground, his knuckles still bruised from the fire. "She hasn't made a sound in a year," he said, his voice thick with a raw emotion she had never heard from him before. "Not one." "I didn't try to make her," Grace said softly. He lifted his eyes to meet hers, a flicker of something new in their depths. "That's probably why it happened." He looked down again, as if searching for the right words. When he looked up, the question in his eyes was naked and honest. "Where did you learn to bake like that?" Grace looked down at her flour-stained hands, a lifetime of memories in their calloused palms. "My mother taught me. I used to help her prepare the Sunday bread. The kind she said could make a man weep if you let it sit too long." He held her gaze, a profound connection passing between them. "Is that why you left?" he asked. "Did you run from the grief?" Grace's breath caught. She met his eyes, a steady, unyielding truth in her own. "I didn't run from anything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm just looking for a place where I can breathe." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and for the first time, something in his face softened, just a little. He tipped his hat and turned back into the dark. Grace watched him go, her heart beating a quiet rhythm under her apron. She returned to her cot, the scent of baked bread still clinging to her skin, and the sound of a child's laugh echoing in the corners of her little shed. It was not much, but it was more than she had yesterday. The townsfolk had begun to whisper. It started small, the way rumors do, a seed planted in the dusty wind. It grew between sacks of flour at the general store, behind hymn books at Sunday service. She bakes in his yard, lives by his barn, and she's not kin. The judgment was swift and sharp. A grown man, a widower with a girl to raise, and now a young woman's moved in like a ghost from nowhere. Grace Evans, wasn't she the preacher's girl back in Kansas? The one who ran off. The wind carried it all. Grace heard none of it, but Calder did, and so did the men who worked under him. By the second market day, heads turned when she passed with her baskets of bread. Some smiled, others muttered. Grace kept her eyes on her work, but gossip, once it finds a breath, tends to grow teeth. One afternoon it came riding in on horseback. Willie Grant, a blacksmith by trade, a brute by nature. He had once asked Grace to marry him. Twice, in fact. She had said no both times and then disappeared. Now he had come to collect what he believed he was owed. He dismounted like a storm, his boots stomping toward the barnyard where Grace had just pulled the last loaves from the firestone. Annie was sitting quietly in the swing, humming tunelessly to herself. Calder was repairing a fence post nearby, his back to the road. Grace saw him first. The rage in Willie's eyes was a familiar, terrifying sight. His voice rose before he even reached her. "So this is where you've been hiding," he snarled. "Playing house with a man and his brat." Grace straightened, the tray of bread cooling in her hands. "I told you I was done, Willie. That should have been the end of it. You left me without a word," he spat. "Because no word would have stopped you. You think you're better now, living with a rancher like some secret wife?" "She is not yours," Calder said evenly, stepping between them. The change in his posture was instantaneous, a sudden stillness that was more menacing than any threat. Willie laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "So she's yours then?" Grace tried to step between the two men. "This is not your place, Willie. Leave." But his hand came fast. A crack echoed through the yard as he struck her across the face. Grace stumbled back, her cheeks stinging, the tray clattering to the ground, loaves spilling into the dirt. Annie screamed, a single sharp sound of pure terror. Calder did not speak. He moved like something unchained. The first punch sent Willie reeling. Dust exploded beneath their boots as fists flew. Calder tackled him hard into the earth, his rage a silent, powerful force. Willie grabbed a plank from the stacked wood and swung, catching Calder's shoulder with a sickening thud. Calder countered with a blow to the gut, then another to the jaw. Blood flew. Grace cried out, scrambling to reach them, but Annie clung to her skirt, sobbing into the fabric. Then Willie scrambled, his hand reaching toward the chopping block, toward the axe. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Willie lifted the handle, rage burning in his eyes. Just before he could swing, Grace threw herself forward, her arms outstretched between them. "Stop!" she screamed. Calder lunged, tackling Willie from behind, wrenching the axe away and slamming him into the dirt. He did not speak. He did not scream. He simply stood, heaving, his chest rising and falling. "Get off my land," Calder growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "If I ever see you near her again, you will not walk away next time." Willie spat blood, glared, and scrambled back to his horse. He rode off without a word, a coward fleeing a storm. The yard fell silent. Grace stood shaking, her hair wild, a thin line of blood at the corner of her mouth. Annie still clung to her waist, sobbing, burying her face in Grace's skirt. Calder turned slowly. His eye was already swelling, and blood trickled from a cut on his temple. Their eyes locked. Neither spoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Calder's voice came, breathless and low. "You can leave if you want," he said. "But if you stay, do not leave me again." Grace swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've never seen anyone fight for me," she whispered, her voice trembling, "without asking for something back." His voice cracked. "I'm not asking." She stepped forward, gently reached for his hand. He did not pull away. Neither of them smiled, but something passed between them, warm and wordless. And as the sun dropped low over the ridge, they stood still. Two battered hearts with blood on their skin, silence on their lips, and a fire burning between them neither had lit, but both could feel. The sky was the color of bruised lavender as evening settled over the ranch. The dust from the fight had long since been swept away, but the memory of it still lingered in every heartbeat, every glance. Calder sat on a wooden stool just outside the shed, his shirt off, a bruised shoulder and a split on his collarbone. Grace knelt beside him, a wet cloth in her hand, carefully blotting away the dried blood. Neither spoke. The silence was not heavy. It was tender, like the hush of a church after the last hymn. Her hands were steady, even as her heart trembled with the memory of the axe and how close it had come. "You should have let me finish it," Calder muttered, his voice gravel low. Grace didn't look up. "You did finish it. You're still here. That's enough." He was about to answer when they both heard it, the softest shuffle behind them. Annie. The little girl had crept up silently, barefoot in the dirt, her doll trailing behind her like a shadow. She stood there for a long moment, then stepped forward. Without a word, she reached out and placed her small hand into Grace's free one. Grace froze. Slowly, she turned her head to the child. Annie looked up at her, her eyes wide, fragile, and full of something unspoken. Then, softly, clearly, she whispered, "Mama, bake." The world stopped moving. Grace's lips parted, but no words came. Calder, still seated, turned sharply toward the sound. He did not rise. He only stared at his daughter, at the little girl who had not spoken in a year, now saying two words that cleaved the silence like a hymn-breaking stone. His throat clenched, his eyes shone. He did not speak either. Grace knelt there, the cloth in one hand, Annie's fingers curled in the other, and let the moment fall around them like dusk, gentle, profound, alive. Later that night, the oil lamp glowed warm in the corner of the shed. Grace had cleaned the cot and laid out a quilt. Annie curled up at the foot of the bed, her doll beside her, her eyes heavy but awake. Grace sat beside her with a book in her lap, its corners worn, its spine cracked. She had found it among old trunks Calder had left untouched in the barn. A collection of fairy tales, the kind with giants and forests and girls who found their way home. She read softly, her voice steady. Annie's eyes fluttered. Her small chest rose and fell. For the first time since she arrived, Grace watched the child fall asleep without flinching, without crying, without the whimper that had haunted the barn walls every night. She leaned down, brushed a curl from the girl's forehead, and whispered, "Good night, Annie." Outside, the crickets began to sing. The wind, softer now, whispered through the grass, as if even the prairie knew something had changed. The morning after Annie's words, the air felt different, thicker, quieter, reverent somehow, like the land itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Grace moved through her usual chores with hands steadier than before, though her thoughts drifted constantly to the night before, to the weight of Annie's hand in hers, to the sound of that soft little voice calling her Mama, Bake. It clung to her heart like a melody too beautiful to hum aloud. She was in the shed sorting flour when she heard the knock. Not urgent, not loud, just enough to make her turn. Calder stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his face unreadable. His knuckles were still bruised, but the swelling around his eye had faded. He looked cleaner than usual, as though he had scrubbed his shirt harder that morning, maybe even combed his hair. The quiet of the shed filled the space between them. The story, it seemed, was only just beginning. It was a subtle effort, the kind a man makes when he is not used to offering anything but means everything. The clean shirt, the faint scent of shaving soap, the way his fingers curled around something tucked deep in his pocket. He stood at the threshold of Grace's shed, hat in hand, a silent question in his eyes. "I brought something," he said, his voice a low rumble. Grace wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron and stepped closer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plain, worn cloth, tied with a bit of fraying string. The careful way he held it, the weight of it in his calloused hand, spoke volumes. He handed it to her without a word. Grace glanced at him, then at the bundle. Her fingers, still dusted with flour, untied the knot and peeled the cloth open. Inside, resting in the soft, worn fabric, was a simple silver ring. It was slightly tarnished with age, but clearly old and cared for. Along its outer edge, time-worn engravings still danced in delicate curves. A flower, a vine, a faded sunburst. She looked up, her throat suddenly tight. "It was my mother's," Calder said, his gaze fixed on the ground beside her feet. "She wore it until the day she passed. Said no woman should be without something she can call her own." Grace held the ring in her palm. The metal felt cool and solid. A piece of someone else's past suddenly offered to her. Her heart thrummed in her chest. "I don't have speeches," he said, shifting his weight nervously. "No poetry. I cannot tell you you're the answer to prayers. I don't even know if I've prayed since Martha died." He paused. A long breath of a man who hasn't spoken a mouthful of truth in years. "But you're here." And she laughed. "And I haven't felt this kind of quiet in years. The kind that lets a man breathe." Grace's chest rose with a slow, shaky inhale. He wasn't giving her empty promises. He was giving her a piece of his grief and his healing. He was giving her his honest, broken heart. "I don't know what happens next," he said, "but I know you deserve something. Something that holds." She looked down at the ring again. Then, with a hand that was not quite steady, she slid it onto her finger. It was a little loose, a little cool, but it rested there like it had been waiting all along. She took his hand in hers, their hands meeting in the narrow space between them. "You did not ask a question," she whispered. His eyes, dark and honest, met hers. "I do not need to." No kneeling, no promise spoken aloud. But in the way he looked at her, in the way her fingers curled around his, it was all there. Every vow, every fear, every quiet, blossoming hope that neither of them had dared name. Grace stepped forward. He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion or possession. It was something older, truer, a benediction. When he pulled away, she was smiling, just barely. "I wasn't looking to be held by anyone," she said. "But you didn't reach for me. You just stood still and let me come close." He nodded once, as if anything more would break the moment. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the wild grass behind the shed. Inside, in that narrow space between two scarred hearts, something had taken root, not loudly, but deep. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning, quiet, with no music, no preacher, and no lace. The meadow behind the Hayes Ranch had burned weeks ago in a flash fire that blackened the wild grass and left the ground a patchwork of ash and green beginnings. Now, where smoke had once curled, stubborn wild daisies were pushing up through the scorched earth, small white promises against the dark ground. Grace stood in a cream-colored dress that had once belonged to Calder's mother. The sleeves had been restitched by hand, and the hem mended with lace from an old pillowcase. She wore her hair braided down her back, a single strand of ribbon tied at the end. Calder had shaved that morning. He looked cleaner than she had ever seen him, but still himself. His boots scuffed, his shirt collar imperfect. The silver ring on her hand was a perfect match to the quiet strength in his face. There was no altar, only a simple wooden bench set between two trees, and no bouquet, just a fresh-baked loaf of bread in the shape of a crooked heart. Annie carried it carefully in both hands. The little girl wore a white dress, wrinkled at the bottom and too short at the sleeves, but she beamed as if it had been made by angels. She had shaped the bread herself with Grace's help the night before, giggling when the sides collapsed unevenly. She placed it between them, reverently, like it was more precious than gold. The townsfolk had come, a few at first, then more. Old man Carter from the mill stood beside the general store clerk. The widowed schoolteacher, Miss Helen, wore a blue shawl and dabbed her eyes discreetly. Even the mayor and his wife appeared, along with 3 of the ranch hands, who had spent years thinking Calder would never speak more than 5 words at a time. Those who had once whispered behind Grace's back now watched her with something else in their eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or quiet admiration. No one mentioned Willie Grant. He had not shown his face since the fight, but the story of what happened that day had spread further than he ever could. They said Calder Hayes fought like a storm for the woman who baked bread in silence, that he bled for her and never once asked her to stay, but built her a fire and gave her a ring and said nothing more. It became a story mothers told their daughters when talking about the kind of love that does not raise its voice but holds its ground. When the vows were exchanged, there were no declarations. Just Calder, holding both of Grace's hands in his and nodding once. And Grace, smiling through her tears, whispering, "Yes!" as if she had already said it in her heart 100 times before. The crowd clapped softly, a gentle, reverent sound that filled the quiet afternoon. Annie, no longer a ghost, reached up with her small, sure hands and took one of Grace's, and one of Calder's. She pressed them together over the heart-shaped loaf of bread. A silent, perfect benediction. For a long time after, the only sound was the breeze through the trees, and the quiet, steady breath of 3 people who had found a home in the ashes. 1 year later, the Hayes Ranch had changed in quiet, but undeniable ways. The relentless wind still swept across the plains, but it no longer felt so lonely. The worn-out fences stood straighter now. The barns would looked less tired. And where the old cattle shed once leaned crooked and forgotten, a new structure stood. It was painted a clean, hopeful white, with wide windows that drank in the sunlight. The air around it carried the constant, intoxicating scent of yeast and honey, a promise of warmth and life. A hand-carved sign, simple but beautiful, hung above the doorway. The bread camp. Inside, flour dust sparkled like new-fallen snow in the sunlight that poured through the windows. The tables were low, child-sized, their surfaces worn smooth from use. The benches were sturdy but already had the polish of busy hands. 10 children gathered there each morning, some from town, some from outlying farms. All of them were somewhere on the spectrum of silence, each with their own story of fear or grief that had robbed them of their voice. Grace stood at the front, her apron tied snug around her waist, her hands moving with a practiced care that was both gentle and firm. She taught them how to knead, how to fold, how to shape the dough, not just with their palms, but with a patience they had never known. And as they worked, she taught them something more. Hands that once trembled with unspoken fear now signed, "Thank you," or "Please," the movements of their fingers slow and deliberate. More words slowly formed behind their lips. Not all at once, not all at the same time, but one by one voices returned. Not loud, not perfect, but real. A stuttering request, a whispered thank you, a small, triumphant look that broke through years of silence. Annie was their brightest student. Her little voice, once only a whisper of a laugh, was now steady and proud. She read aloud during story hour, her words clinging to the air like music. She sang to the younger ones as the bread cooled, her melodies a balm to their silent spirits. She taught the signs Grace had taught her, sometimes playfully correcting her mother with a gentle defiance. At night, she curled beside Grace and asked questions about clouds and horses and dreams. Grace always answered. Calder too had softened. He had rebuilt the barn's back room into a small library with shelves of donated books and a single rocking chair beside a potbelly stove. On colder days, the children took turns reading aloud as the loaves baked next door. He would sit in that chair, not as a lonely rancher, but as a man whose world had been filled with the quiet magic of a child's voice. He never said much, but he watched every lesson from the doorway of the bakery, his posture a quiet sentinel. He listened to every laugh that echoed across the yard, and sometimes, on days when the children weren't looking, he sat quietly outside the window. He carved small, smooth wooden animals, a wolf, a horse, a clumsy bear, for them to find under their chairs when they arrived the next morning. It was a secret, a quiet ritual of love. Then, one afternoon in late autumn, a letter arrived. It was simple, folded in plain paper, the handwriting careful and unfamiliar. Grace saw the return address. Rebecca Linwood, a farm an hour's ride north. She opened it and read it to herself first, her eyes wide with shock. That night, she read it aloud by the fire, her voice thick with tears. Annie was curled up beside her, hugging the bear Calder had carved for her birthday. "Dear Mrs. Hayes," Grace began, her voice a little shaky, "my son has not spoken since his father died last spring. No words, no humming, no eye contact. He is 7. Yesterday we stopped by your ranch. You gave him a roll warm from your oven. He ate it without a word." Grace's voice broke on the next line. "That night, before bed, he asked me," his voice small but clear, "Mama, is she an angel?" I cried, not because of what he said, but because of the hope in his voice. "Thank you, Rebecca Linwood." The words hung in the air, suspended in the firelight. Grace's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Calder sat in his chair across from her, his arms stretched along the backrest, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. He did not move. He did not speak. The silence between them was deep but no longer empty. It was full to bursting with everything they had created. Grace leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. He shifted slightly, just enough to tuck her closer, his hand resting over hers, a warm, reassuring weight. Outside, the stars were blooming in the dark, vast sky. Inside, the warmth of the hearth touched everything. Annie stirred, sleep-soft, and whispered, "Can we make cinnamon rolls tomorrow?" Grace smiled, her eyes closed, feeling the beat of Calder's heart beneath her head. "Of course, sweetheart." And then Calder, still gazing at the fire, said it so softly it was almost to himself. It was a phrase he had carried for a year, a truth he was only now ready to set free. "I hired you to bake bread, but you baked my soul back to life." Grace did not reply. She just squeezed his hand. Sometimes there are no words for healing. Sometimes all you need is warmth, a little white flour, and someone who stays. And in that shed-turned home, with the fire humming low and love thick in the air, there was no more room for grief, only bread rising and hearts healed. And that, dear listener, was the story of how a silent child, a broken rancher, and a woman with nothing but her hands and a heart full of grace, built something whole from ashes and bread. No bullets, no grand speeches, just quiet choices, steady hands, and love that rose slow, like dough warming by firelight. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt it in the silence, in that crooked heart-shaped loaf, in the way Calder looked at Grace and saw not her past, but her peace, then tap that hype button to let us know you're with us. And if you want more, love stories like this, tales born of dust, danger, and hearts that don't quit, subscribe now to Legends of Love Stories, because out here on the edge of the world where bullets missed but hearts didn't, love still finds a way. See you in the next story.